Picture this. You're designing a horror game, and every day it seems like the technological limitations you're working under become more and more restrictive. You wanted a small American town setting, but because you're on the PlayStation 1, you need to add fog and darkness to hide your limited draw distance. You wanted survival-focused combat, but you started developing your game 14 months before the DualShock launched with analog sticks. So you're stuck with a hybrid fixed-angle camera and tank controls. You compensate for all of these hurdles thrown your way and manage to actually make the game playable, and then someone on your team suggests that what your horror game really needs is to remove every startling enemy encounter and to play static every time the player shares a room with an enemy. Is it obvious to you that this pitch will cement Silent Hill as the premier horror game franchise? That this pitch will make its way so deep into the scenario direction of these games that it might be called the seminal Silent Hill mechanic? The core idea separating Silent Hill from everything else. In reality, I don't know if this is how the radio static in Silent Hill came about. Maybe it was added because they felt they needed to compensate for the camera angles limiting the player's knowledge of the environment. Maybe it was added because playtesting made enemy encounters a slog. I really don't know, but I am serious about that whole seminal Silent Hill mechanic thing. If I had to distinguish one element from these games that separates them from everything else in the market, it's not the fog, not the overworld, not the psychological horror, monster design, obtuse storytelling, dreamlike ambiance, or any of that. It's the radio. The bigger a creative choice is, the more it ripples across the rest of a game, and the more it adds creative restrictions which everything else has to be tuned around the best practices of. If you want to pitch changes to established formulas, it's really not enough that the new idea sounds good in and of itself. It needs to gel well with the legacy mechanics you're bringing back, and it needs to be able to convey the atmosphere you're trying to evoke. The further back up the core creative decisions you go to make your changes, the more the downstream creative decisions you're going to have to reconsider, since the fundamentals they relied on are no longer there. Auto-aim shooting is a must for Silent Hill because of the tank controls and the way the camera operates. If you went under the hood of the game and wanted to add manual aiming, you could make it so that the player has the option to enter first-person mode when they're aiming, or you could just give the player full control over the camera. But consider what that means for level design and the realistic presentation. The levels are already trying to mask their unnatural height, mandated by the rigid hybrid fixed camera perspective needing to be zoomed out enough and elevated to give the best look of the action. The tank controls helped to never emphasize this, but if the player could manually look around every environment, would this become an issue? And if you instead just dumped all of the fixed camera work and gave the player full analog stick control over it, what does that mean for level design and item placements? As is, the games don't need HUDs or interface elements telling the player what can and cannot be interacted with, because the interactive phenomenon always has very careful attention paid to how the player will come across it. Let the camera go free, and this is no longer the case. There are upsides to the changes as well, but hammering home the essentials which comprise the game as is a must before you start pitching changes, because if you don't know why an implementation was included, your change is probably going to reveal it. The guiding principle for the way Team Silent designed Silent Hill's scenarios differs in interesting ways from how conventional action horror games go about things. The standard formula has the player skulk around in the dark and then has them be startled, often with the appearance of an enemy they then need to overcome or run away from. But Silent Hill almost never makes the presence of an enemy a secret. In fact, the games go out of their way to signal to the player when they're in a room with an enemy, with the radio buzzing. One of the ways Silent Hill approaches horror is with the whole purity and danger dichotomy. Inside versus outside. Clean versus filthy, safe versus unsafe, reality versus nightmare. The buzzing of the radio signals the transition from one state of play, safe, to the other, unsafe. And because the radio telegraphs danger, danger becomes a lingering mood that doesn't overstimulate the senses or leave you frustrated when an enemy jump scare doesn't play the way designers perhaps intended. The player's anticipation of danger and the expectation of safety is often leaned on for creating the atmosphere, and when the games want to create a drastic tonal change, the radio buzzing or silence allowed the developers to communicate that change to the player. The 101 horror gameplay formula slowly builds up to an encounter where the player's anticipation is stretched until it reaches its climax and needs to be released, which is usually done with a jump scare, which restarts the tension cycle. You can do well for yourself by figuring out new angles with which to gamify this simple model. Give the player an activity to engage with, then gradually make things get more and more hectic around them. Force the player to continually engage with their activity in order to keep the danger at bay, all the while making the player's progress amp up the horror. It's not unusual for the jump scare release to put the player back to their last checkpoint or to straight up end a given run. If you can balance out the player's need to progress and engage with their amplifying revulsion from doing just that, you've done your job right. Examples of this simple formula being gamified can be seen in games like Slender or Five Nights at Freddy's. And when I say simple, I'm not really making a quality distinction. Amnesia: The Dark Descent works very similarly. It has more variety, but still. I'm just noting that the actual nuts and bolts of the tension cycle is very much preserved with these games. How much you may or may not enjoy them is completely up to you. If we take this formula and map it on to Silent Hill, there's a lot of sequences which map on quite nicely, but the places where Silent Hill diverges from the standard formula is where the magic might be. The boundaries separating the stages are not so solid in these games. When does the anticipation period begin and end? And furthermore, there are very rarely explicit jump scares to cap them off. I don't know about you, but because Silent Hill blurs the boundaries on this so aggressively, I feel like the anticipation period, the anticipation for horror, is extended across mostly the entire experience, and the release valve of jump scares is instead replaced with temporary off-ramps after a particular moment in the story is reached, or a specific enemy is felled. And the thing about that is that even in the more relatively safe environments, because there's not a big signal given to cap off the horror sequences, their ambiance sort of bleeds into the more mundane environments, and I begin to feel the game's uncanny mood quite a bit more than I think I would have if they'd have gone down a more traditional route. And in the horror sequences, because knowledge of the enemies is communicated with the radio, their ability to spook the player is undermined, but instead, the player can instantly shift from one mode of conceptualizing the space they inhabit to another. And every time I go from one room to another, I always find myself dreading whether or not I'm going to hear the static and I'm going to have to fight something. And because there's no loud jump scare followed by a hard reset, because the separated stages of the conventional tension cycle have been merged and blurred the way they have, the stress just sort of compounds. Instead of a quick and easy startle to send us on our way, it's 30 minutes of stressing for our character's life. Silent Hill doesn't really work if you don't engage with it for an extended period of time, but the payoff there is that once you're in, you're really in, and the games can start to make large contributions to their atmospheres with simple lighting tricks or environmental design choices which you might not even notice in other games. The upfront investment in the experience of Silent Hill is much steeper than in your average horror game, but because of that, and because of how the tension cycle isn't reset every 5 minutes and the dread of the encounters is stretched for so long, a 30-minute play session of Silent Hill is almost certainly going to be a lot more emotional, a lot more stressful and impactful than a 30-minute play session of practically anything else. Keeping that in mind, let's go back to the idea of making big changes to the way the game is set up. We talked a bit about manual aiming, now let's think what happens if we gave Silent Hill aggressive autosaving. As is, we have sparsely distributed manual save points which the player needs to, drumroll please, manually activate. These make it so that the player can have half an hour of progress on the line at any given time, which I'd argue really works to make the player engage with the game for longer, and for the larger upfront investment in the experience we just went over to actually be committed to. I'd also argue that the save setup helps create the dread feeling. When you encounter an enemy, there's often quite an investment of time at stake, and the longer you go, the more you invest in a given run, the more you're going to be stressing over your held resources. a wonderful horror loop. When you put the enemies down, there's a bit of tension release, sure, but the unfriendly camera angles, the clunky combat, and the resource management often make it so that you're much worse off after an encounter than you were before. You're more safe in the immediate moment, but you don't make progress by standing around in a room you've cleared out. You make progress by risking the progress you've made so far, and since you're putting extended time investment on the line with every step you take, and since each enemy encounter has the possibility of seriously eating into your resources and putting you in a worse position than you're already in, whatever small tension release you get from killing a single monster is practically negligible. As I just went over, there's a lot of juice to be gotten from balancing the player's need to advance with their revulsion from doing just that. I'm not saying all of these design choices came about fully formed or anything, but across the original run of Team Silent's games, you can see them perfect the crafting of this tension in their gauntlets, so even if this setup wasn't planned, I'm confident it's something they picked up on. And one way the developers put a spin on this balancing act was by throwing in the element of the unknown. If the player ignores fighting and simply runs past the enemies, they're risking both that they don't get a free hit in and that their destination is the correct one. The only thing worse than having to clear out a segment full of monsters is having to clear it out after you spent the last of your health running past them to avoid fighting them in the first place, only to find out that you ran yourself into a dead end. Silent Hill refuses to easily restart the tension cycle. Keep that in mind if you're put in charge of designing a Silent Hill game and decide to make any drastic alterations to any of the core fundamentals we've discussed so far. I was compelled to make this video because of the reception to the Silent Hill 2 remake gameplay trailer. For the record, I'm not inherently opposed to remakes, and when remakes happen, I encourage changes. As many as humanly possible, such that the remake can be evaluated on its own merit rather than endlessly having to borrow goodwill from the original title. A remake which just swaps out old visuals with newer, spiffier graphics is just about the most uninteresting thing I can imagine. Nuances being conveyed by the original style will inevitably be lost in translation, and the whole thing reeks of having been made for all the wrong reasons. But a good remake can revitalize interests in dormant series, and it can allow for failed ambitions to be retried. I consider the latest spate of Resident Evil remakes to be some of the best AAA games we've been getting over the past few years, and what I really appreciate in them is that they are so stylistically different from the original games that the threat of them being replaced is non-existent. The reason changes are made is because audience tastes change, and because the way we think about designing games has come a long way from back when nobody knew how to even work with 3D polygons. But in the course of that evolution, certain ways of thinking have become standardized. Back when Silent Hill 1 was being made, the creative team was quite literally composed of the non-compliance and troublemakers from Konami's various departments. And because there was no great roadmap to how to make 3D horror games, they were inventing much of the rules as they went. And as game design evolved and ideas became standardized because their implementation was superb in a given title, what was often neglected was the greater context surrounding that idea. We have a tendency to critically evaluate games by looking at their core components rather than considering how they interact with the rest of the experience. If you're modernizing Silent Hill, you might want to address the argument that the original Silent Hill games had bad combat. But they really didn't. They had combat tuned around a specific emotion and for a specific emphasis. Do you remember Team Ico's Ico? Combat there happens when the player is trying to escort Yorda around, but the shadow creatures arrive to try to kidnap her. For that game, the developers deliberately tuned down the combat because if it were an engaging activity on its own, then players might begin to feel like having to save Yorda was taking them away from the more fun activity of fighting the enemies. And if the player began to think of Yorda that way, it would hamper the relationship the player is supposed to build with her. For Ico and Silent Hill, since that's the series I'm actually talking about here, you can absolutely make the argument that the combat isn't fun, But to make a quality call, I feel you need to take into account why things were designed the way they were, what information and characterization is inferred from the system we have, and even though I get the it's boring combat argument, and I wouldn't really want to play with this system in and of itself, disconnected from the context we find it in here, even though I can see where a lot of people are coming from, the mood just lands for me. And because of that, I can't say that the combat here is bad. I'm not inherently against the idea of the presentation being changed, but I'd need to see that the priorities which Team Silent had are being respected with whatever new system is cooked up, because just addressing that sort of knee-jerk Silent Hill had bad combat complaint can take you into some bad places design-wise. Silent Hill's clunky combat often made it so that if you got yourself cornered in a hallway full of enemies, the best choice you had was simply to turn off the flashlight and run through the enemies to a safe distance and hope that you wouldn't get hit. You can say that the game was sort of lacking for minute-to-minute options in the enemy confrontation department, but what combat tools can you give the player to escape that specific scenario, cornered in a hallway, which does not impede your ability to direct other sequences in the game? Now, I don't know if the Silent Hill 2 remake does the following, and I don't suspect it will, but let's just use this as a thought experiment. You could give the player a context-sensitive dodge. If an enemy is about to hit the player has a brief window to press a button to activate the dodge and avoid taking damage. This way, the optimal route from the cornered in a hallway scenario I just laid out is to weave your way through the horde and hope your timing of the dodging is good enough. But if this were to be included, surely the player is going to gravitate towards a more aggressive and confrontational playstyle, since they've been given a reliable and dedicated mechanic for avoiding damage. Considering that, do we think this mechanic is a good idea? Does it faithfully recreate the spirit of the original Silent Hill, or does it subvert it in favor of player convenience? Another knock-on effect this purely hypothetical dodge ability would bring with it would be to alter the characterization of James Sunderland, which is not a good idea, and funneling the player into this reckless way of playing the game also causes issues if the remake were to include the multiple endings. Spoiler warning for Silent Hill 2. The original game had hidden player choices, and acting suicidally by taking a lot of damage, by examining Angela's knife, etc., would nuts the player towards the suicide ending. If enemy encounters in the new game give the player more outs than the original did, and does so without forcing the player to pay for it somehow, so loss of health, ammo, or something, if the player is given an objectively better way of playing the game which also makes aggressive strategies more optimal, the player will not develop the natural instincts to be careful and contemplative, nor might he give much thought at all to his safety. Harry Mason, James Sunderland, and Heather Mason are not action heroes. They are normal people in abnormal circumstances, and the combat in their games reflects this. What does it say about James Sunderland that he doesn't do well in fights? That the optimal playstyle has the player constantly backing away from the enemies coming towards them and taking pot shots from a distance, or turning off the lights and sneaking past the enemies? This is a problem any remake is going to face. Developers will always have to consider the ramifications of their changes and how their new setups can preserve the intent of the original and its mood. For Silent Hill, however, this is even more of a problem because the scenario direction in the original games was so dependent on weird and antiquated mechanics which had all been bundled on top of each other. Old presentation styles, things like fixed camera angles and tank controls, feel antiquated to new players, but that still doesn't mean you should switch to analog stick camera controls and dust your hands, job well done. If you take the camera and put it in the hands of the player, the design choices and characterization and scenario direction and ambience and every other creative choice made downstream of the camera setup in the original Silent Hill games has to be reconfigured. If the player could manually aim the gun in Silent Hill, if they could just look into whatever direction they wanted without any fuss, then the enemies need to be redesigned such that they still pose a threat. If the radio buzzing is included, You know, that magical, most important of all Silent Hill mechanics, which is the backbone of the tension cycle. It needs to justify its existence, but since we can't hide enemies with camera angles, we need to rely on environmental clutter, darkness, fog, corners, vents, etc. to hide the enemies for us, and this means we need to take a hatchet to the fundamentals governing the best practices for the camera setup in the original games, the level design, or the enemies themselves. Maybe we go full Resident Evil 2 remake and put the camera right up to James's back, such that the player needs to constantly worry about being caught from behind by an enemy they can't see. Maybe we have fewer enemies, since there are fewer places to hide enemies when the player can look wherever they want, and we make those enemies stronger to compensate. Maybe we add more maneuverability to the enemies to take advantage of the new aiming system, let them crawl on the ceilings and such. That could actually be pretty cool. Silent Hill 3 had those sniffer enemies which crawled around the floor, but if we did the ceiling crawl, remember that almost every Silent Hill enemy was designed by Masahiro Ito to embody humanity. They aren't monsters with sharp teeth, they are disfigurations of the human form, so if we let them crawl on the ceilings and such to take advantage of the manual aiming, maybe we lose that humanity they have in the process. Also, manual aiming means an aiming reticule. One of the great benefits of the original title's auto-aim was that you didn't need to prioritize the overlay visuals, so when you were fighting, you were mentally free to ponder at the enemy's physiology and the weird ways they jittered about. Anyways, if we drop the changed behaviors of the enemies and instead choose to start messing around with the level design to create more hiding spaces for the enemies to let the radio buzzing, most important Silent Hill mechanic of them all, still direct the experience, we have the potential of landing in new pitfalls. Silent Hill's environments were already pretty tight and claustrophobic, so to add clutter, maybe we need to widen the spaces. In fact, to accommodate the freer camera, we might need to do that anyways. And if the free-moving camera happens to widen the hallways and rooms to accommodate it, are we still going to be preserving the spirit of the original? It's not impossible. You can definitely fake tight space by adding darkness or fog, which obfuscates everything around the player. Think of it like a soft border. The original Silent Hill games almost always did that in open spaces, and it managed to preserve the feeling of being in a really tight space without actually having to restrict the player's freedom of movement. You absolutely can preserve the spirit of the original in the camera department and the level design, and I can imagine ways in which the new setup allows for some new and exciting scenarios for older mechanics. Assuming the map is completely interconnected, I can totally imagine a cool sequence where the radio buzzes in a hallway and we have a tense extended sequence of opening up all of the apartments and trying to find and take out the enemies. Original Silent Hill had the radio buzz be locked to the room you were in, since they needed to load the new levels behind each door, but having those environments be physically connected allows for the player to now be flanked. So if the player is walking down a hallway, enemies could jump out at them from the doors, and this makes for more uncertainty since there are more directions to worry about than just what's in front of you and what's behind you. The developers of the original games can lament that they would have done things differently if the tech had allowed for it, but that doesn't mean the setup we got was wrong. They chose the path they did, and they built the encounters and the atmosphere on the best practices of the restrictions that setup imposed upon them. Whether they wanted those restrictions or not, they worked tirelessly within them to make the best games they could. Oftentimes, in the original games, the player is forced to rely on the snap auto-aim feature because the enemy in the room can't actually be seen right away because of the camera angle. Would the developers have preferred to give the player full control over the camera? Maybe. But the setup we got was a choice. Every decision was a choice. Even if they were compromises which the developers chose to embrace. And if you want to go there, you might say Silent Hill is the single franchise most compromised by technological limitations of all time. From the tank controls to the camera to the draw distance, fog and darkness, even if every element of these games was compromised, they still served as the foundations for these games, and changing the foundations now that the technology allows for it requires surgical skill because you still need to preserve the downstream choices made to highlight the best practices the setup they had imposed. The dodge I talked about is purely hypothetical. I don't know if it's in the remake, and I'm not even completely against adding a feature like that if you can circumvent the negatives that implementation were to bring with it. And this applies to every change, by the way. I can totally believe that every mechanic can be replaced and the experience can still be preserved, because the new system is capable of eliciting the same emotion as the older one. By the time this video releases, the Silent Hill 2 remake is not out yet, and ever the optimist, I'm going to hope that the changes Bloober Team is making are being made while appealing to the guiding principles, characterization and atmosphere of the original game. I can imagine a Silent Hill game working without tank controls. Same with the clunky combat, same with the obtuse storytelling, same with the camera system. But for the life of me, if you remove, say, the radio, and don't replace it with any mechanic which picks up the slack for directing the mood minute to minute, I can't see how the Silent Hill ambience can possibly be preserved. It can look like Silent Hill and sound and speak like Silent Hill, but that's not nearly enough. The bigger creative changes you make, the more they ripple across the rest of the game, and the more you need to compensate for the lack of fundamentals which other mechanics took for granted. Here's hoping we get some good Silent Hill games. If you want more of my Silent Hill observations, be sure to peruse the channel, as it's a series I've gone back to many times. Maybe check out some of my commentaries on the second and third game, and soon, the fourth. I'm currently keeping busy finalizing my game, and at this pace I'll hopefully have a demo to share with you shortly. Stay tuned for that video. I'm AesirAesthetics, thanks for watching, until next time.